Tonight, we journey through the remarkable life of Benjamin Franklin, inventor, writer, diplomat, and one of the most influential minds of early America. From his humble beginnings in colonial Boston to his revolutionary contributions in science, politics, and philosophy, Franklin's story is one of curiosity, resilience, and relentless pursuit of knowledge. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. We hope this gentle dive into history helps you relax, unwind, and drift peacefully into rest. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin the extraordinary story of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17th, 1706, in a small wooden house on Milk Street, not far from Boston's Old South Church. He was the 15th of 17 children born to Josiah Franklin and his second wife, Abiah Folger. Josiah, an English immigrant, made a living as a candle and soap maker, a humble but respectable trade. Abiah, descended from Puritan settlers, brought with her a deep sense of faith and practicality, qualities that would strongly influence her young son. Life in the Franklin household was strict and industrious. With so many mouths to feed, the family ran like a small factory, and every child was expected to contribute. Even as a child, Benjamin displayed a restless intellect and boundless curiosity. He had only 2 years of formal schooling, just enough to learn the basics of reading and arithmetic, but it was clear early on that he had a sharp and eager mind. When finances prevented further education, Benjamin took to self-study, devouring books by candlelight and copying essays to improve his handwriting and spelling. His appetite for reading was insatiable. At a young age, he was drawn to works by classical authors, religious tracts, and contemporary essays. His father, recognizing his love for learning but needing him to learn a trade, initially considered training him for the clergy. However, the costs were too high, and instead, Josiah apprenticed Benjamin to his older brother James, a printer. It was a decision that would profoundly shape the course of his life. At just 12 years old, Benjamin began working at his brother's printing shop, a demanding job that introduced him to the world of language, publishing, and public discourse. The shop printed pamphlets, sermons, and newspapers, and Franklin absorbed every word. He became skilled at setting type, operating the press, and managing the many physical and mental demands of the trade. But beyond the technical side, it was the world of ideas that captured his attention. The relationship between Benjamin and James was, however, far from easy. James was hot-tempered and strict, often clashing with his younger brother. Franklin chafed under his brother's control, and their frequent disagreements sowed the seeds of Benjamin's deep belief in personal liberty and freedom of expression. Around this time, James launched a newspaper called the New England Courant, which was a bold and provocative publication for its time. It featured essays and commentary that pushed the boundaries of acceptable opinion in Puritan Boston. Too young to publish under his own name, Benjamin began submitting satirical letters to the paper under the pseudonym Silence Doe Good, posing as a witty widow who critiqued society with sharp insight and clever humour. The letters were a hit with readers, and for months, no one knew the true author. When James eventually discovered the truth, he was furious, both at the deception and at the talent his younger brother had shown. This conflict only escalated, especially after James was imprisoned for printing material that offended the colonial authorities. Benjamin took over the paper in his absence, but the experience intensified his desire for independence. By the age of 17, Franklin made a daring decision. He ran away. With little money and few connections, Franklin left Boston and headed to New York, seeking work as a printer. Failing to find opportunity there, he continued on to Philadelphia, a city that would become his lifelong home, and the place where his genius would truly flourish. Arriving with just a few coins in his pocket and a loaf of bread under each arm, the teenage Franklin walked the streets of Philadelphia in worn clothes and messy hair, unaware that he was stepping into the beginning of a new chapter. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in 1723, tired, hungry, and soaked from a storm. He was just 17, a runaway apprentice with little more than his wit and ambition. Yet even in that bedraggled state, he caught the eye of Deborah Reed, the daughter of a local shopkeeper, who would later play a significant role in his life. Philadelphia was a bustling city compared to Boston. It was growing quickly, full of opportunity, and far less rigid in its religious and social structures. Franklin quickly found work at a local printing house, impressing his employer with his skill and diligence. He was determined to rise, and he threw himself into his trade, reading constantly and networking with others who shared his love of ideas. His talent and ambition didn't go unnoticed. In 1724, Pennsylvania's governor, Sir William Keith, promised to fund Franklin's trip to London, encouraging him to acquire the printing equipment needed to start his own press back in Philadelphia. Trusting Keith's word, Franklin set sail for England, but upon arrival, he found that no letters of credit had been sent. Keith had deceived him. Stranded in London without money or connections, Franklin once again had to rely on his resourcefulness. He found work at a printing shop and used the opportunity to sharpen his skills and expand his horizons. London, with its lively intellectual circles, bookstores, and coffee houses, offered Franklin a first-hand look at Enlightenment thinking. He read works by John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton, and began forming his own views on politics, philosophy, and science. Although he enjoyed his time in London, Franklin longed to return to America. After nearly 2 years abroad, he sailed back to Philadelphia in 1726. He worked briefly as a clerk for a merchant, but soon returned to printing, his true passion. With help from financial backers, he eventually established his own printing business. This marked a major turning point in his life. He was now his own master. Franklin was not only a skilled printer, but also a savvy businessman. He launched the Pennsylvania Gazette, which would become one of the most successful newspapers in the colonies. Under his direction, the paper became a platform for civic discussion, public debate, and Franklin's own clever essays, which he often published anonymously or under pseudonyms. In 1732, he began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, an annual publication that combined weather forecasts, household tips, proverbs, and witticisms. It was wildly popular, thanks to Franklin's talent for blending humor with wisdom. Sayings like, "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise," became part of the American cultural lexicon. But Franklin's ambitions extended beyond business and writing. He believed deeply in community improvement and self-education. In the 1730s, he founded the Junto, a club for young working men to gather and discuss philosophy, politics, and self-betterment. From this group came a flood of initiatives that would shape Philadelphia's future. Franklin helped establish the first lending library in America, allowing those without means to borrow books. He also spearheaded efforts to improve public safety, creating the first volunteer fire department and advocating for better street lighting, sanitation, and policing. His love of science and experimentation also began to take shape as he started conducting small experiments and observations in his spare time. Throughout this period, Franklin's personal life was also evolving. He had a common-law marriage with Deborah Reed, the woman who had first seen him walking the streets of Philadelphia years earlier. Together, they raised several children, including William, Francis, and Sarah. Franklin's role as a husband and father was often overshadowed by his relentless pursuits, but his affection for his family remained a constant presence in his letters and reflections. By his early 40s, Franklin had already achieved more than most men did in a lifetime: printer, writer, entrepreneur, community organizer. But he was just getting started. As he began to pull away from the day-to-day operations of his printing business, Franklin would soon turn his attention toward greater challenges: understanding the forces of nature, engaging in scientific discovery, and eventually entering the complex world of politics and diplomacy. By the 1740s, Benjamin Franklin had grown into one of the most respected figures in Philadelphia, not just as a printer or writer, but as a thinker and innovator. With his business flourishing and his newspaper and Poor Richard's Almanac generating steady income, Franklin began stepping back from commercial life. He devoted more time to his expanding intellectual interests and civic projects. His mind, always curious, now turned fully toward the natural world. He was fascinated by how things worked, from the movement of storms to the behavior of heat and light. But the field that most captured his imagination was electricity, a relatively mysterious force at the time. Reports from Europe had begun trickling into the colonies about new discoveries, and Franklin was eager to experiment himself. Using simple tools, glass tubes, metal rods, and bits of cloth, Franklin and his friends conducted their own electrical experiments in his home. He published his findings in a series of letters and papers, which were later compiled into a book titled Experiments and Observations on Electricity. In these writings, Franklin proposed new theories about electrical charge, including the concepts of positive and negative charges, and introduced terms like battery, conductor, and electrician, many of which are still used today. Perhaps his most famous experiment was the legendary kite and key test in 1752. Franklin hypothesized that lightning was a form of electricity. To prove it, he flew a kite during a thunderstorm, attaching a metal key to the string. When he saw sparks jump from the key to his knuckle, he had his answer. Lightning and electricity were indeed the same. This bold, dangerous experiment captured imaginations around the world and cemented his reputation as a leading scientific thinker. Franklin's discoveries earned him honorary degrees from both Harvard and Yale, and later from universities in Europe. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society in London and was awarded the prestigious Copley Medal. His work was not just brilliant, it was accessible. Unlike many scientists of the era, Franklin wrote in clear, engaging language that allowed people outside academia to understand and appreciate his work. He believed that knowledge should be shared widely, not hoarded. His scientific mind also had practical applications. Franklin invented the lightning rod, a simple but revolutionary device that protected buildings from fire by grounding lightning strikes. He also invented bifocal glasses, the Franklin stove, which improved heating efficiency, a flexible urinary catheter, and even a musical instrument called the glass harmonica, which was played by Mozart and Beethoven. What set Franklin apart was not just his ability to invent, but his motivation behind it. He wasn't driven solely by profit, but by the belief that science and innovation should serve the public good. To him, progress was a shared endeavor. He often refused to patent his inventions, insisting that they belong to the people. As his renown grew, Franklin also deepened his involvement in public service. In 1743, he helped establish the American Philosophical Society, the first scientific society in the American colonies. Around the same time, he became increasingly active in colonial politics. He was appointed as the postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737, and later as joint postmaster general for all the colonies, a position that helped him build connections across British America. By the mid-1750s, Franklin was not only a celebrated scientist and writer, but a statesman in the making. His understanding of communication, his diplomatic skill, and his growing influence made him a key figure in colonial affairs. He was soon called upon to represent Pennsylvania in negotiations with Native American nations and British officials, laying the groundwork for his later role on the international stage. Yet even as he gained stature, Franklin never lost his sense of humor or humility. He remained grounded in the values he had carried from his youth: thrift, hard work, curiosity, and public service. His voice, both in print and in person, was reasoned and persuasive. He could command the attention of scholars and common folk alike, bridging worlds with ease. As the 1750s drew to a close, Franklin's influence was reaching its peak in both scientific and civic circles. But he was also becoming increasingly concerned with the growing tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown. A new chapter of his life, one that would push him onto the global political stage, was just beginning. As the 1750s turned into the 1760s, the American colonies found themselves at a crossroads. Tensions were rising between Britain and her colonial subjects, fueled by debates over taxation, representation, and imperial control. Benjamin Franklin, already established as one of the most prominent intellectuals in the colonies, now began to shift his focus from scientific discovery to political engagement. Franklin's first major foray into politics came during the French and Indian War, a conflict that pitted the British and American colonists against the French and their Native American allies. In 1754, Franklin proposed what became known as the Albany Plan of Union, an ambitious attempt to unify the colonies under a single government for mutual defense and cooperation. Though the plan was ultimately rejected by both the colonies and the Crown, it marked a turning point. It was one of the earliest formal proposals for colonial unity. At the heart of the Albany Plan was Franklin's belief that the colonies, though diverse, shared enough in common to act together for the greater good. It was a visionary idea that would gain much more traction in the years to come, as calls for independence grew louder. Meanwhile, Franklin's own political career continued to rise. He was appointed as Pennsylvania's representative to the British Crown and sailed once again to London in 1757. What was initially intended as a brief mission would extend into a nearly 2-decade stay, as Franklin became the primary colonial voice in Britain. He acted as a diplomat, lobbyist, and negotiator, advocating for Pennsylvania's interests and eventually for broader colonial concerns. In London, Franklin moved with ease among the British elite. He was admired for his intellect and wit, and often dined with philosophers, scientists, and political figures. But as the British government began imposing harsh new policies on the American colonies, such as the Stamp Act of 1765, Franklin's position became more complicated. The Stamp Act, which placed a direct tax on printed materials in the colonies, sparked widespread outrage. Colonists argued it was taxation without representation, a violation of their rights as Englishmen. Franklin initially sought a peaceful resolution. He testified before Parliament, explaining the colonists' perspective and warning that continued taxation without consent would lead to unrest. His calm, reasoned testimony helped sway Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, a moment that temporarily boosted his reputation on both sides of the Atlantic. But the relief was short-lived. More taxes followed, along with stricter regulations and growing resentment. Franklin, once a proud British subject who had considered himself loyal to the crown, began to question Britain's motives. His faith in reconciliation weakened further when private letters he had acquired, written by colonial governors and recommending a crackdown on American dissent, were published in Boston in 1773. Though Franklin hadn't written them, he was blamed for their release. The scandal, known as the Hutchinson Letters Affair, led to Franklin's public humiliation before the British Privy Council. He was harshly criticised and stripped of his post as Deputy Postmaster General. The incident marked a turning point in Franklin's political life. It was the moment he ceased trying to mediate between Britain and the colonies and began to fully embrace the colonial cause. Returning to America in 1775, after nearly 20 years abroad, Franklin found a country on the brink of revolution. The battles of Lexington and Concord had already taken place. The colonies were no longer asking for fair treatment. They were preparing for independence. Though Franklin was 70 years old by this time, he threw himself into the revolutionary movement with the same energy and focus he had brought to his earlier pursuits. He joined the Second Continental Congress and helped draft the Declaration of Independence, working alongside Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others. His wisdom, experience, and deep understanding of diplomacy made him an indispensable figure in these formative years. Even in the chaos of impending war, Franklin remained calm and strategic. He understood the stakes, not just for America, but for the future of representative government. As he would later write, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." As the war escalated, Franklin's role expanded yet again. The newly formed United States needed allies, and once again, it would be Franklin who traveled across the Atlantic to secure them. As the American Revolution raged across the colonies, Benjamin Franklin was entrusted with one of the most critical tasks of the entire war, securing support from France. The fledgling United States, facing one of the world's most powerful empires in Britain, desperately needed allies, money, and military aid. In 1776, at the age of 70, Franklin was appointed as one of the first American ambassadors and set sail once more for Europe. This time, not as a subject of the crown, but as a representative of an emerging nation. Arriving in Paris, Franklin entered a world of elegance, excess, and deep political intrigue. The French court, centered around King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, was steeped in ritual and formality. Franklin, with his simple Quaker-style dress and plain manners, stood in stark contrast to the powdered wigs and gilded salons of Versailles. Yet, this very contrast became his advantage. The French people, and especially the intellectual elite, were captivated by Franklin. They saw in him a living embodiment of Enlightenment ideals: reason, science, republicanism, and self-made success. He became a celebrity overnight. His image appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, and paintings. Parisians greeted him in the streets like royalty. In salons, he charmed philosophers, poets, and politicians with his wit and wisdom. He didn't chase power through pomp. He won hearts through authenticity. But behind the charm lay a serious strategy. Franklin's mission was to persuade the French government to openly support the American Revolution, not just with good wishes, but with military and financial aid. France, still smarting from its loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, was intrigued but cautious. They feared backing a losing cause and provoking Britain into war before the time was right. Franklin worked patiently, building relationships and subtly persuading France's leaders that American independence was not only just, but achievable. He sent carefully worded reports back to Congress, coordinated with American agents, and forged secret agreements for supplies. His diplomatic style was unconventional but effective. He used humor and humility, mixed with intellect and persistence. Then came a turning point. In 1777, General George Washington secured a major victory at the Battle of Saratoga, capturing a large British army. This triumph changed the international perception of the war. For France, it was proof that the American cause had real teeth. Franklin seized the moment. In 1778, he successfully negotiated the Treaty of Alliance between France and the United States, a monumental achievement. France officially recognized American independence and agreed to provide military support against Britain. It was a diplomatic triumph that would alter the course of the war. French troops, ships, weapons, and funds began pouring into the American fight, culminating years later in the decisive French-American victory at Yorktown. Franklin's influence extended beyond formal diplomacy. He played host to visiting American officers, coordinated communications between American and French leaders, and helped manage delicate negotiations between competing interests within the American delegation. Despite his age and health challenges, he remained tirelessly committed to the cause. Yet Franklin never let the weight of politics overshadow his appreciation for the arts, science, and human connection. He continued to correspond with European scientists, experimented with his glass harmonica, and spent time in the French countryside, enjoying long walks and thoughtful conversation. He was a statesman, yes, but also a humanist. In 1783, Franklin played a lead role in negotiating the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the Revolutionary War. The treaty recognized American independence and granted generous boundaries to the new nation. Franklin, along with John Adams and John Jay, stood as representatives of a dream that had once seemed impossible. Franklin had outmaneuvered empires, swayed kings, and helped secure a future for a people still finding their identity. He had done what few others could. He used diplomacy, not just weapons, to win a war. After nearly a decade in France, Franklin returned to America in 1785. He was now nearly 80, his health was failing, but his spirit remained unshaken. He was welcomed back not just as a hero, but as a founding figure of an entirely new nation, one whose very ideals had been shaped in no small part by his pen, his mind, and his unrelenting pursuit of liberty. When Benjamin Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1785, he was met with a hero's welcome. Though nearly 80 years old and suffering from chronic illness and painful gout, Franklin was far from retired. His days of discovery and diplomacy may have passed, but he still had one last critical role to play, shaping the future of the American Republic. In the years immediately following the Revolutionary War, the United States found itself at a fragile crossroads. The government established by the Articles of Confederation was proving too weak to manage the challenges of a newly independent nation. Economic troubles, border disputes, and political division threatened the very unity Franklin had spent a lifetime promoting. In 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. Franklin, The oldest delegate at 81 was a symbol of wisdom and unity. His presence alone lent gravity to the proceedings, and although his physical condition often kept him from speaking for long periods, his words carried enormous weight. Franklin's contributions were marked by moderation, pragmatism, and an unwavering belief in compromise. He reminded the younger delegates that no government would ever be perfect, but that collective agreement, not individual purity, would preserve the republic. When tensions ran high and debates turned bitter, it was Franklin who offered calming counsel. He urged cooperation, famously remarking, "When you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views." Despite being in constant pain, Franklin attended the sessions regularly, often carried in by sedan chair. He supported a strong central government balanced by the rights of the people and favored a system that could adapt with time. While he didn't agree with every article of the final constitution, he was one of its most vocal advocates for ratification. His signature, placed alongside Washington, Madison, and Hamilton, gave the document powerful legitimacy. Even in his final years, Franklin remained intellectually active. He returned to his writings and resumed leadership in civic affairs. He served as president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery and submitted a petition to Congress in 1790 calling for the end of the practice nationwide. Though Congress ultimately tabled the petition, Franklin's stance was clear. He believed slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the republic he had helped build. Franklin's final written work was a biting satire in response to a pro-slavery argument made on the floor of Congress. With sharp wit and moral clarity, he dismantled the logic of slavery's defenders, revealing the hypocrisy of those who claimed liberty while denying it to others. It was a fitting final act for a man who had always used his pen as a tool of justice. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790, at the age of 84. The news of his death was met with mourning not only in America, but across Europe. In France, the National Assembly wore mourning badges, and tributes poured in from writers, scientists, and leaders around the world. In Philadelphia, more than 20,000 people attended his funeral, nearly the entire population of the city at the time. Franklin's will left gifts to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia to be used for public good over a 200-year span. Even in death, he was thinking ahead, planning not just for the next generation, but for the ones after that. His legacy is vast. A signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution, Franklin is the only founding father to have signed all four of these foundational documents. But even more than the titles he held or the honors he received, it's the ideas he championed that endure. Self-education, civic responsibility, free expression, scientific inquiry, diplomacy, tolerance, humor. These were the building blocks of Franklin's life, and through him, the building blocks of a nation. He was born the son of a candle maker in a modest Boston household. He died a world-renowned statesman, inventor, and philosopher. Along the way, he redefined what was possible for a person and a people, driven by curiosity, compassion, and courage. Benjamin Franklin left no royal bloodline. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of Marie Curie, the pioneering scientist whose brilliance and determination shattered barriers and reshaped the world of science. From her quiet beginnings in Poland to the discovery of radioactive elements and her historic Nobel Prizes, Curie's journey is one of intellect, courage, and enduring legacy. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. We hope this story offers comfort and calm as you drift into a peaceful night's sleep. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin the powerful and inspiring story of Marie Curie. Marie Curie was born Maria Sklodowska on November 7th, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland, which at the time was under Russian control. She was the youngest of 5 children in a deeply intellectual household. Her father, Władysław Skłodowski, was a physics and mathematics teacher, and her mother, Bronisława, was the headmistress of a girls' boarding school. Education wasn't just encouraged, it was a way of life. However, the family's passion for learning was met with a harsh reality. The Russian authorities that controlled Poland were wary of Polish nationalism, and they imposed heavy restrictions on education. Schools were forced to teach Russian history and language, while Polish culture and science were suppressed. The Sklodowskis lived under constant surveillance and systemic discrimination. Even so, Maria's love for learning blossomed early. Tragedy struck the family more than once. When Maria was just 10, her mother died of tuberculosis, and shortly before that, her eldest sister passed away from typhus. These losses left an emotional scar, but they also seemed to strengthen Maria's resolve. She buried herself in books, finding comfort in literature and science, and continued to excel in her studies despite the growing weight of grief. As a girl, in Russian-controlled Poland, Maria had very limited access to higher education. Women were not allowed to attend the University of Warsaw, so she enrolled in the Floating University, a secret underground school that offered classes to Polish students in defiance of Russian laws. In dimly lit rooms and hidden locations, Maria and other eager learners discussed science, philosophy, and the dreams of a freer future. But Maria knew her education in Poland would never be enough. She dreamed of studying in Paris, where the world's leading scientific minds gathered and women could pursue formal higher education. Yet, the path to Paris was far from simple. Her family lacked the funds to send her abroad, so she and her sister Bronia struck a pact. Maria would work as a governess, sending her earnings to support Bronia's medical studies in Paris. Later, Bronia would do the same for her. For the next several years, Maria lived in the Polish countryside, working long hours for wealthy families while continuing her studies in secret. By day, she taught children and managed household duties. By night, she read textbooks on physics and chemistry by candlelight. She endured isolation and even heartbreak, falling in love with the son of the family she worked for, only to be rejected due to her social status. Still, she remained focused. Every coin she saved and every hour she studied brought her closer to Paris. And finally, in 1891, at the age of 24, she boarded a train and left everything familiar behind. She arrived in France under a new name, Marie, and enrolled at the Sorbonne, one of the most prestigious universities in Europe. Paris, in the 1890s, was a city of ideas, electricity, and revolution, not just political, but intellectual. But for Marie, it was also a city of hardship. She spoke little French at first and lived in freezing, cramped apartments, surviving on little more than bread and tea. Yet despite the hunger and the cold, she thrived academically. She devoured the works of Newton and Lavoisier, and by 1893, she earned her degree in physics. A year later, she obtained a second degree in mathematics. Her brilliance caught the attention of her professors, but she remained humble and focused, always more interested in ideas than recognition. Her next goal was clear: to find meaningful scientific work. And in 1894, a meeting arranged by mutual friends would set the course of her future, in both science and life. She met Pierre Curie, a quiet, equally brilliant physicist with a deep appreciation for the unknown. They bonded over their shared love of research and a mutual respect for one another's minds. It didn't take long before professional collaboration turned into something deeper. A year later, in 1895, they were married. Together, they would become one of history's most iconic scientific duos. But at this stage, they were simply two passionate minds beginning to unlock secrets that would change the world. After their marriage in 1895, Marie and Pierre Curie began what would become one of the most extraordinary scientific partnerships in history. Though they lived modestly, Marie wore a simple blue dress instead of a white wedding gown. They shared an unwavering devotion to science. Their apartment was filled not with decorations but with books, lab equipment, and ideas. It was here that Marie began to search for her own area of scientific focus. At the time, one of the most exciting developments in physics was the discovery of mysterious rays by Henri Becquerel. He had found that uranium salts emitted an invisible energy that could fog photographic plates, even through black paper. These emissions didn't fit neatly into the known laws of physics, and few fully understood what they meant. Intrigued, Marie chose this phenomenon as the subject of her doctoral research. Using a sensitive tool called an electrometer, which Pierre and his brother had invented years earlier, Marie measured the strength of the rays given off by various substances. She made a remarkable observation. The intensity of the radiation was directly related to the amount of uranium in the material, and it didn't depend on the material's chemical form. This suggested something revolutionary. The radiation came from the atom itself, not from molecular interaction. This was a bold and controversial idea. At the time, atoms were thought to be indivisible and unchangeable. The notion that energy could escape from the very core of an atom was unheard of. But Marie was undeterred. If uranium emitted this energy, might other elements as well? She began systematically testing other materials, particularly minerals that contained uranium. One mineral in particular, called pitchblende, produced radiation far stronger than uranium alone could explain. This meant there had to be another, unknown substance in the ore, one that was far more radioactive. Excited by the possibility of discovering a new element, Marie and Pierre worked together in grueling conditions. They obtained tons of pitchblende from mining companies and set up a primitive lab in an old shed near the School of Physics and Chemistry in Paris. The space was drafty, poorly ventilated, and often freezing. They stirred boiling vats by hand, inhaled toxic dust, and worked with radioactive materials long before the dangers were fully understood. Their days blurred into nights. It was painstaking, dirty work. Marie once described the lab as a cross between a stable and a potato shed. Yet through this exhausting process, they managed to isolate a new element. In 1898, the Curies announced the discovery of polonium, named by Marie after her homeland of Poland, which at the time still lacked independence. Just a few months later, they made an even more extraordinary discovery. A second, even more radioactive element, which they named radium. The significance of these discoveries was profound. Not only had the Curies identified new elements, but they had also unlocked a new understanding of the atom and a mysterious force, one that could pass through solid matter, generate heat, and affect the body in invisible ways. By coining the term radioactivity, Marie helped define an entirely new field of study. Her work demonstrated that the atom was not the solid, indestructible particle scientists had long believed. Instead, it was dynamic, filled with energy, and capable of transformation. These discoveries shook the scientific community. The world was beginning to realize that the tiny building blocks of matter held tremendous power. Power that could be used for healing or harm, for discovery or destruction. In the midst of this scientific whirlwind, the Curie family also grew. In 1897, Marie gave birth to their first daughter, Irene, and later to a second daughter, Eve, in 1904. Balancing motherhood with intense research was never easy, but Marie never let it slow her pursuit. Pierre, ever supportive, viewed their work as a joint mission, one in which both their minds were equally valuable. Recognition soon followed. In 1903, Marie and Pierre, along with Henri Becquerel, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their work on radioactivity. Marie became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize, a groundbreaking moment not just in science, but in the fight for gender equality in academia. And yet, even as the world began to acknowledge her brilliance, she continued to work with the same humility, same hunger for truth, and same unwavering curiosity. Her ambition was not fame, it was knowledge and the belief that science could be a force for good. But just as their work reached new heights, life would throw an unexpected and devastating blow. By 1903, Marie and Pierre Curie had become household names in the world of science. Their discovery of radium and polonium had changed how humanity understood the atom, and their shared Nobel Prize had cemented their place in history. Yet for all their accomplishments, their lives remained modest and grounded. They continued to live simply, uninterested in wealth or social status. For the Curies, the laboratory was their sanctuary, a place of purpose, precision, and shared passion. But that sense of sanctuary would be shattered. On April 19th, 1906, tragedy struck. While crossing the busy Rue Dauphine in Paris during a heavy rainstorm, Pierre Curie slipped on the wet cobblestones and fell beneath the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage. The impact was fatal. He died instantly, his skull crushed under the weight of the cart. The news devastated Marie. The love of her life, her partner in science, her intellectual equal, was gone in a moment. She plunged into a deep and private grief. Those closest to her described her as pale, silent, and broken. For days, she could barely speak. In her journals, she wrote haunting entries addressed to Pierre, describing her sorrow and the unbearable silence of their home without him. And yet, even in the depths of despair, Marie refused to give up the work they had started together. Just a few weeks after Pierre's death, she returned to the lecture hall at the Sorbonne, stepping into the role that he had once filled. In doing so, she became the first woman to teach at the Sorbonne, standing before a class of male students who looked on in stunned silence. She didn't speak of the tragedy. She simply picked up the chalk, turned to the board, and began teaching physics, continuing the mission they had shared. Marie poured herself back into research. Grief became fuel, and her laboratory once again became a place of solace and purpose. She resumed her work with radium, meticulously isolating tiny amounts of the element through endless hours of chemical processing. Her goal was to better understand the properties of radioactive materials, not just to harness their power, but to comprehend their behavior on the atomic level. In 1911, her perseverance was recognized once again when she was awarded her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her discovery of radium and polonium, and for her groundbreaking work in isolating pure radium. This made her the first person in history to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields. It was a feat unmatched in her time and rarely equaled since. But recognition brought controversy as well. Around the same time, rumors began to circulate about Marie's personal life. She had developed a quiet relationship with physicist Paul Langevin, a former student of Pierre's who was separated from his wife. When their affair was made public by the press, Marie was vilified, targeted not only for the scandal, but for daring to be a woman of intellect and independence. The newspapers were ruthless. Headlines branded her a homewrecker, questioned her character, and even implied that she, as a foreign-born woman, had no right to a second Nobel Prize. The backlash was vicious and often laced with sexism and xenophobia, but Marie remained dignified and silent. When the Nobel Committee hesitated to formally invite her to the award ceremony, suggesting she avoid the attention, she responded with unwavering calm. Her answer was simple. The prize was for her scientific work, and her private life was of no concern to them. She accepted the Nobel in person. Throughout all this, Marie continued raising her 2 daughters, Irene and Eve, instilling in them the same values that had guided her life: curiosity, discipline, and resilience. She encouraged Irene in particular to study science, laying the foundation for another generation of discovery. And even as she pushed scientific boundaries, Marie never lost sight of the practical applications of her work. She was deeply interested in how radium could be used in medicine, especially in treating cancer. She helped establish research institutes and trained young scientists, many of them women, to carry on this new and promising field of radiology. By the start of the First World War, Marie Curie was not just a scientist. She was a symbol of what was possible. And in the face of a world again descending into chaos, she would once again choose action over fear. When World War I erupted in 1914, Europe was plunged into devastation. The conflict brought unimaginable suffering, and for Marie Curie, now in her late 40s, the call to action was personal and immediate. She had already given the world new elements and reshaped the foundations of physics, but now her science would serve a different battlefield: the hospitals. X-ray imaging, still a new technology at the time, had the potential to revolutionize battlefield medicine. It allowed doctors to see bullets, shrapnel, and broken bones without surgery, potentially saving countless lives. But the military was unprepared. X-ray machines were scarce and rarely available near the front lines. Marie saw this as unacceptable. In her mind, knowledge meant responsibility. If science could ease suffering, it must be used to do so. Without waiting for government approval, she mobilized her own resources. She raised funds, secured vehicles, and gathered equipment. With the help of her daughter Irene, who was just 17 at the time, she designed mobile X-ray units that could travel directly to field hospitals. These vans, soon known as Petite Curies, were nothing short of revolutionary. They brought X-ray imaging to the front lines of the war, often the difference between a soldier losing a limb or having it saved. But Marie didn't stop at designing them. She trained dozens of women, including Irene, to operate the equipment, read the images, and care for the wounded. She even learned to drive the vehicles herself and often traveled to the battlefronts in person, braving gunfire and harsh conditions. Over the course of the war, it's estimated that more than 1 million soldiers were treated with the help of her mobile X-ray units. Her leadership and innovation turned radiology into a critical tool of battlefield medicine and helped establish it as a permanent fixture in hospitals around the world. But the war years also deepened her understanding of the risks associated with her discoveries. Long-term exposure to radioactive materials had already begun to take a toll on her health. Still, there was little awareness of the dangers of radiation, and safety procedures were virtually non-existent. Marie had handled radium with her bare hands for years and stored glowing samples in her desk drawers. The damage was already done. After the war, Marie focused on rebuilding what had been lost, scientifically, personally, and nationally. She returned to the Radium Institute in Paris, which had been completed in 1914, just as the war began. The institute became a hub for medical research, training a new generation of scientists and doctors, many of them women, in the growing field of radiology. Marie believed deeply in empowering women through education and encouraged them to step into fields that had long excluded them. In the 1920s, she also began traveling internationally, advocating for funding, scientific collaboration, and public access to knowledge. One of her most notable tours was in the United States in 1921. American journalist Marie Mattingly Meloney, inspired by Curie's humility and brilliance, launched a national campaign to raise money for a gram of radium, an element so rare and expensive that Marie herself could not afford to continue her research with it. The campaign caught fire. Women's groups across the United States donated small amounts, raising the then astronomical sum of $100,000. When Marie visited the US, she was greeted with tremendous admiration and was even received at the White House by President Warren G. Harding, who presented her with the radium personally. But Marie, ever modest, accepted it not as a gift for herself, but as a tool for research and healing. She made it clear, the radium belonged to the Radium Institute, not to her. Through all this, she continued her quiet, persistent work, teaching, experimenting, and advising governments and scientific societies. Her daughter Irene followed closely in her footsteps, eventually winning her own Nobel Prize in Chemistry with her husband Frédéric Joliot-Curie for discovering artificial radioactivity. The legacy was not just continuing, it was evolving. Still, the years of exposure to radiation were beginning to show their cost. Marie's health deteriorated slowly, and she suffered from chronic fatigue and symptoms consistent with what would later be diagnosed as aplastic anemia, a rare condition likely caused by long-term exposure to high radiation levels. And yet, she never expressed regret. To her, the risks were worth the knowledge gained. In a world filled with destruction, she had chosen creation. In a time of war, she had chosen healing. And even in the face of illness, she chose to keep working, believing to the end in the promise of science to make the world better. As the 1920s came to a close, Marie Curie's once robust health had begun to fade. Years of working closely with radioactive materials, without protective gear, without knowledge of the dangers, had taken a toll on her body. She was often fatigued, her eyesight weakened, and she experienced bouts of pain that grew more frequent with each passing year. Still, she worked. Despite declining health, Marie continued to direct the Radium Institute in Paris, oversee research, teach students, and consult with scientists from around the world. She remained deeply involved in medical applications of radium, particularly its growing use in cancer treatment. She helped guide doctors and radiologists in safely applying the new science of radiotherapy, laying the groundwork for the modern fight against cancer. The institute itself had blossomed under her leadership. It became a world center for radioactivity research and medical science. Scientists from around the globe came to train under her guidance, including future Nobel laureates. Her dream of a space where curiosity, cooperation, and discovery could flourish regardless of gender or nationality, was coming to life. Throughout these years, Marie also travelled to promote science education and international collaboration. In 1925, she returned to Poland to lay the cornerstone of the Radium Institute in Warsaw, a sister facility to the one she led in Paris. It was an emotional moment. Though she had long lived in France, Poland had never left her heart. She was returning not just as a scientist, but as a national hero. But her impact wasn't limited to laboratories and lecture halls. Through her quiet strength, Marie Curie had become a symbol. To countless young women, she represented possibility. She had defied a world that told her no. No to university, no to science, no to recognition, and transformed it into yes. She didn't do it by shouting or demanding. She did it by doing. She had turned a childhood shaped by grief and oppression into a lifetime of discovery. She had balanced motherhood with groundbreaking research, love with loss, and illness with resilience. She had redefined what was possible for a woman and for a scientist. As the 1930s began, her health worsened rapidly. She remained active for as long as she could, but in 1934, at the age of 66, Marie Curie died from aplastic anemia, a condition believed to be caused by her prolonged exposure to ionizing radiation. She passed away quietly in a French sanatorium. There were no dramatic final words, no crowds, no fame-chasing tributes, just a soft end to a brilliant life that had illuminated the darkest corners of the atom. She was buried next to Pierre in a simple ceremony, but history would not let her rest quietly for long. In 1995, over 6 decades later, Marie Curie's remains were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, a rare honour reserved for France's greatest figures. She became the first woman to be interred there on her own merit, not as the wife of a famous man, but as a giant in her own right. Even today, her notebooks and lab tools remain radioactive, stored carefully behind leaded glass. Her legacy, literally and figuratively, still glows. Marie Curie's name is etched into the periodic table, into the heart of every cancer patient treated with radiotherapy, into the history of science, and into the imagination of every young girl who dares to ask why, and believes in her right to find the answer. Her daughter Irene would continue her work and carry her name forward, winning a Nobel Prize of her own. But Marie Curie had already won something greater, a place in the collective memory of humanity, not just as a scientist, but as a quiet, tireless force of transformation. She didn't seek power. She didn't seek wealth. She sought knowledge, and through it, gave power to others. Her life, lived in the shadows of X-rays and radium, cast one of the brightest lights science has ever known. As the 1920s came to a close, Marie Curie's once robust health had begun to fade. Years of working closely with radioactive materials, without protective gear, without knowledge of the dangers, had taken a toll on her body. She was often fatigued, her eyesight weakened, and she experienced bouts of pain that grew more frequent with each passing year. Still, she worked. Despite declining health, Marie continued to direct the Radium Institute in Paris, oversee research, teach students, and consult with scientists from around the world. She remained deeply involved in medical applications of radium, particularly its growing use in cancer treatment. She helped guide doctors and radiologists in safely applying the new science of radiotherapy, laying the groundwork for the modern fight against cancer. The institute itself had blossomed under her leadership. It became a world centre for radioactivity research and medical science. Scientists from around the globe came to train under her guidance, including future Nobel laureates. Her dream of a space where curiosity, cooperation, and discovery could flourish, regardless of gender or nationality, was coming to life. Throughout these years, Marie also traveled to promote science education and international collaboration. In 1925, she returned to Poland to lay the cornerstone of the Radium Institute in Warsaw, a sister facility to the one she led in Paris. It was an emotional moment. Though she had long lived in France, Poland had never left her heart. She was returning not just as a scientist, but as a national hero. But her impact wasn't limited to laboratories and lecture halls. Through her quiet strength, Marie Curie had become a symbol. To countless young women, she represented possibility. She had defied a world that told her no. No to university, no to science, no to recognition, and transformed it into yes. She didn't do it by shouting or demanding. She did it by doing. She had turned a childhood shaped by grief and oppression into a lifetime of discovery. She had balanced motherhood with groundbreaking research, love with loss, and illness with resilience. She had redefined what was possible for a woman and for a scientist. As the 1930s began, her health worsened rapidly. She remained active for as long as she could, but in 1934, at the age of 66, Marie Curie died from aplastic anemia, a condition believed to be caused by her prolonged exposure to ionizing radiation. She passed away quietly in a French sanatorium. There were no dramatic final words, no crowds, no fame-chasing tributes, just a soft end to a brilliant life that had illuminated the darkest corners of the atom. She was buried next to Pierre in a simple ceremony, but history would not let her rest quietly for long. In 1995, over 6 decades later, Marie Curie's remains were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, a rare honor reserved for France's greatest figures. She became the first woman to be interred there on her own merit, not as the wife of a famous man, but as a giant in her own right. Even today, her notebooks and lab tools remain radioactive, stored carefully behind leaded glass. Her legacy, literally and figuratively, still glows. Marie Curie's name is etched into the periodic table, into the heart of every cancer patient treated with radiotherapy, into the history of science, and into the imagination of every young girl who dares to ask why and believes in her right to find the answer. Her daughter Irene would continue her work and carry her name forward, winning a Nobel Prize of her own. But Marie Curie had already won something greater, a place in the collective memory of humanity, not just as a scientist, but as a quiet, tireless force of transformation. She didn't seek power, she didn't seek wealth, she sought knowledge, and through it, gave power to others. Her life, lived in the shadows of X-rays and radium, cast one of the brightest lights science has ever known.